The presenters will speak first. And thereafter, Prof. Marconi will engage in conversation with our presenters today for around 10 to 15 minutes. And after that, we will have a Q&A session moderated by Professor Bessie Antia. So the last half hour is usually the after-party session, and this is a very informal session with no formalities, and we're able to have a free discussion. You're welcome to stay if you would like. And also, while the presentation is ongoing, please feel free to write your questions or your comments in the chat box. Before I introduce the speakers, I would just like to give the floor to Stephanie Radwig, who would like to address us on the upcoming Language and Race Journal. So Stephanie, over to you.
I'm only going to step in very briefly because I think we have a very exciting conversation ahead of us. So this is not about the journal, a journal, but I want to announce that Sinfri Marconi, Bessie Antia, and I have a couple of months ago signed a contract with Routledge for a handbook on language and race. And so the idea of the handbook is really to provide a southernizing, a decolonial lens on current scholarship, creating a very much an all-inclusive community. So we would like to, we welcome all kinds of multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and undisciplined Tommaso work, and we would also be quite happy if those of you who are not in a position to submit an abstract or the paper, that perhaps you can spread the call. I will post the call in our chat so that it's available to everyone. Ideally, we also would like to include a promising PhD students into this project. So the idea really is to create a discourse on language and race outside of the dominant Anglo-American discourse, with focus on African scholarship and also with the specific inclusion of, from my perspective, African women scholars as well. So anyone that you have in mind that could be having interest in contributing to this volume on language and race, please spread the word. We now extended the call to the end of the month. The final papers are only submitted in June next year, so there is really quite a bit of time, but we would like to actually finalize the contributions by the end of the month. So that's all. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Sounds like a very exciting project. Okay, so now I can introduce our speakers for today, who will be speaking on the topic of signs of difference or conversation. So Susan Gall is the May and Sidney G. Metzel Distinguished Service Professor of Anthropology and Linguistics at the University of Chicago. And Judith T. Irvine is the Edward Sapir Distinguished University Professor of Linguistic Anthropology at the University of Michigan. Thank you so much for being with us today, Professor Gall, Professor Irvine. The floor is yours.
Okay, I'll start. Hello, and thank you so much for introducing us. I'm Judy Irvine, as you can probably tell, and I want to begin by thanking Sinfri for inviting us, and thanks also to the online audience for joining in. What we're going to try to do is to sketch out some of the contents of our book. It's sort of a lightning tour, providing a bit of context and explanation. And since we are co-authors, we'll be switching back and forth in doing this. So Sue, your turn.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Sue Yao, as you might have guessed, and I also thank Cynthia very much for the invitation. And to those of you who've come online to join us, it's a pleasure to be able to talk to you about our book. Collaborations, I think, often pique readers' interest in how the work was done, how it came about. So let me say a few words about that. By the time we became acquainted, we both had published quite a lot. We had well-established track records. In fact, it was our separate work that brought us together, our separate ethnographies. In reading each other's papers and listening to each other at AAA meetings, we noticed a really surprising parallel between two of our field sites that were otherwise really worlds apart, as Judy will mention later. A small town in Eastern Europe and one in Western Africa, in Senegal and Hungary. That observation about the possible similarities is what brought us together, got us thinking together. We were trying to figure out how and why such different sites handled differentiation in such similar ways. The happy result, certainly happy for us, I hope you too enjoy it, has been a quite abstract semiotic approach for handling linguistic and social differentiation. The book is full of ethnographies and observations that go well beyond our own ethnographies, although the approach handles our own ethnographies quite well. Let me add that it's also true that before we became actually acquainted, that is like talking to each other and so on, we did have a lot in common. We studied at two different doctoral institutions, but they were what I would like to call the East and West Coast headquarters of the movement that in the 1960s and 70s became sociolinguistics and the ethnography of speaking. And those two were Penn on the East Coast and Berkeley on the West Coast. In fact, our mentors, John Gumpertz and Del Himes, had collaborated on some of the works that launched those very directions. It's kind of funny that we then ended up together. Another parallel was our experience of the field's development in the following decades. We each participated in the semiotic turn that made the work of pragmatist philosopher Peirce important in cultural and linguistic anthropology. And then quite separately, we ended up heading the interest in how linguistic practices relate to political economy, power, difference, and inequality. Funny to recall that each of us, we just talked about this the other day, each of us published a paper on language and political economy in the same year in different journals. So our work was converging, and so was the field itself on the theme of language ideologies. Judy?
Yes, language ideology as a theme took off after about 1990 as a focus of research in linguistic anthropology and related fields. People in our field had become, as Sue said, increasingly interested in language's relation to political economy and with power relations in talk and in linguistic practices generally. Language ideology is basically ideology that is focused on language or talk or discourse rather than on political systems more directly. Language ideology then concerns how ideas and assumptions about language are linked with power and politics. It's also therefore about differentiation because power relations are concerned with social difference. That is, in some social domain, who has a greater say than somebody else? Whose social or personal projects get to move forward more easily than somebody else's? But the term ideology has a complicated history with both pluses and minuses for us. What we like about it is the link with power and difference. And this is a link that doesn't work so well with a concept of culture, for example. In contrast to culture, a concept of ideology immediately points you toward power and difference, and toward the ways that difference is entailed in social relations. Ideology incorporates a point of view on society, politics, and power, and it implies that people in a society occupy different subject positions with different points of view on their social surroundings. But a drawback to the term ideology, which one needs to recognize, is that it's often assumed to mean false consciousness, to be about how people in power pull the wool over other people's eyes and make them act in ways to their own disadvantage. Now, I would not say that people in power never try to do that. We have many examples of that in the world today. But if you talk about false consciousness, that implies that you know the truth in some absolute sense. And I don't think that Sue and I want to claim quite that much. And besides, if everything somebody believed were totally false, they couldn't survive So their beliefs and their view of the world could not be entirely false. So we find it more helpful, instead of false consciousness, to think of ideologies as partial. Partial because an ideology represents only one point of view among several, one perspective on the world among others, but partial also because ideologies are connected with social projects, favoring some that somebody is partial to over others. But even the problematic aspect of the term ideology, the one of ideology as false consciousness, has its better side, because in common parlance, ideology is outside the rarefied realms of academia. Ideology is usually something other people have, while we have a better idea about what's going on, a truer idea. So that already entails a differentiation of ideas. For example, during the Cold War, Americans would talk about Soviet or communist ideology. For example, ideology was what they did, which we knew to be wrong. But no matter how totalizing a particular ideology might seem from the inside, it always posits that there may be infidels, people who fail to believe. And so again, there's differentiation everywhere you look about ideology. Well, our discussions in this book, and even before the book, have moved beyond the early treatment of language ideology in our field. One of our moves is to characterize ideology as a regime of value. That is, it assigns differing value or importance and implications in some domain. And this gets you away from the false consciousness stuff. And it also points to how a regime of value sweeps up other kinds of signs besides linguistic signs. A regime of value tends to spread, it seemed to us, to leak into whatever you're doing and thinking about. Another move that we emphasize in our book is that we often prefer to focus on ideological work rather than ideology as an object of research. Ideology, the noun, too easily suggests a thing, like a rock that might hit somebody over the head. The noun suggests that maybe it's something internally consistent and bounded, or maybe even static. Or maybe ideology is seen as some official doctrine, when we're just as interested in how people act in everyday life. So ideological work instead points towards social action and toward how people develop activities that draw on assumptions, that engage semiotic practices, that mobilize social projects. The ideological constructs that are developed in such ideological work are always emergent. They're part of a changing world. And although they may persist over a long time, or parts of them may, they may also evolve and shift along with the world that they're in. Sue?
Yes. Well, a large part of our book, like I think I would say a third of it, is about semiotics. And I think it's not self-evident why to turn to semiotics in analyzing language ideology. So I'm going to use language ideology alternatively to ideological work and regimes of value, just as Judy said. And also, as she said, ideological work implies social action, persuading and mobilizing oneself, but also others. And persuasion involves communication, which implies the study of signs. That's semiotics. So once we're going to get into communication as an aspect of ideology, which is necessary, we're already into semiotics. And in thinking about signs, we started with something very broad of the human ability to focus jointly on something, to pick it out and contrast it with a background. And from there, from that really fundamental start, we found Peirce's theory of signs most useful, as I mentioned before. So we learned from Peirce that anything in the world can be a sign if it's taken to be a sign by someone. So there are conventional signs. Language is the best example. But there are also signs like smoke that signals fire that are utterly non-linguistic. In fact, signs can be gestures, clothing, objects, even storms within the framework that we're using and developing. So in noticing any material or cognitive or emotional phenomenon, people are likely to wonder, what might it be a sign of? And this focus on interpretation, on uptake, to bringing attention to things has lately become important in sociolinguistics under the rubric of listening being as important as speaking. I think that's something to draw attention to. So it is now central, as central, I think, in sociolinguistics as the idea of analyzing speaking. Regimes of value, that is ideologies, pick out what might be a sign, how to take it up. And we took seriously also Peirce's notion that action and meaning are two sides of a coin. Though ideologically directed action, with that, people notice something and they make active guesses about what it might mean. Peirce called these guesses interpretants, but I have found in teaching this and in talking about it that this confuses people very much. It makes it sound like people are interpreting, but that's not what he had in mind. He called them interpretants, but what he meant was conjectures, guesses, right? People use everyday knowledge to form conjectures about what might be going on. Each act of conjecture implicates further conjectures and revision in chains of inquiry. A very brief example is something like, my friend is wearing a long black coat walking down the street. Why is he doing that? What could that signal? I ask myself and wonder, is he going somewhere fancy? Or is he in mourning? Oh, wait, no. I recall he's in a play, he's in a theater piece. I bet he's playing a priest. And you see how you're making guesses and transforming the guesses. We know that guesses, conjectures, are always socially located in situations and in longer histories. So signs are embedded in the flow of social life that we all enter in midstream inevitably. And signs like that black coat are not separate from the social world they represent, as we might think of language being separate. They're not separate. They are part of that world. And knowledge grows through chains of guesses. Peirce called them abductions, but I think that it's clearer to call them chains of guesses. So not just any guesses, because social actors have social positions with interests and expectations about relationships, about social relations. And these positions constrain the knowledge that they can access. So the conjectures they can make are conditioned by the social positions they have. Those positionalities change people's guesses, and they constrain people's point of view, what we call perspectives, in how they guess about signs. Any one perspective, of course, indicates the existence of other perspectives and implies that one can set up comparisons between them. Comparison and perspective are central to our approach to regimes of value. Now, this has many reasons to do it, but one that appeals particularly to us is that power works through comparative valuation of people types and of social worlds by defining what is taken for granted, what is valuable, what is persuasive in social life. This power dimension reminds us that comparison is never neutral. It's always part of projects, excuse me, and it's part of struggles in the social world. So we use our comparisons of our separate ethnographic cases to figure out a single process of social and linguistic differentiation for participants and for observers. It's the same. And it's a semiotic process that involves what we've called, and I will name them now, but we'll get back to them later. We have called them the making of axes of differentiation, projecting what we call rematization, fractal recursivity, and erasure. So more later on how these combine to organize ideological work. Judy?
Okay, so I want to talk about ethnographic cases and what part they play in our larger agenda in the book, because a section of our book that comes right after the introduction focuses on two separate ethnographic cases. Now, one of the roles that these two ethnographic chapters play in the book is to illustrate how our general approach can illuminate the analysis of any particular ethnographic case. It's that this approach takes you to analytical points you might not otherwise have thought of. It's certainly done that for each of us, because these cases come from our own ethnography, our own fieldwork. But this section of the book is also, in effect, about comparison. In fact, as Sue mentioned, our collaborative work emerged from comparing our ethnographies and comparing these two cases. Now, I'm sure you recognize, knowing what these two cases are, I'm sure you recognize the vast differences between them. One coming from a town of mainly Wolof speakers in Senegal, and one from a town of German-Hungarian speakers in Hungary. These are sites that have very different histories, ecologies, different language families, different political settings. There's nothing in the specific histories, languages, or dominant economies that would lead anybody to juxtapose these two particular cases. They're both people. The towns are somewhat similar size. That's about it. So we were surprised to find that nevertheless, our fieldwork revealed some common themes. In both cases, local residents characterized the major social differences within their communities in terms of a contrast between austerity and elaboration. So one set of people within the community was considered austere in language, in talk, in gestures, in personal values, dress, food preferences, housing, and whatever. While another set of people, in contrast, were considered elaborate in their behavior, flamboyant, fancy, maybe hyperbolic, and so on. So how should one even describe this pattern, this common pattern, let alone account for it? We felt that we could only do so by moving to a more abstract kind of discussion, independent of the particulars of language, history, economy, and so forth, although still responsible to those particulars as evidence. Our move was into semiotics as a way of capturing the differentiations people in these two places made that they were attending to, the many signs of social difference which these people were assembling into the broad tropic contrasts of austerity versus elaboration. We certainly do not want to claim that this particular trope, austerity and elaboration, will be found everywhere. Not at all. The point is, instead, that the semiotic analysis enables comparisons one might not have thought were possible. And it allowed us to explore how ideological work applies in many domains, linguistic and otherwise, in much more detail. Now, about the case that I provided, when I first went to Senegal, I began observing many kinds of verbal performance, including everyday talk, and how these genres of communication were socially situated, especially how they were linked to the social hierarchies and local level politics that people in that field site so intensely cared about. Later, that topic, that kind of topic, led me toward thinking about ideology and its involvement with language. Well, in the town where I worked, there was at the time a pretty conspicuous differentiation between linguistic registers, ways of speaking Wolof. This difference was even labeled. One register was relatively florid and elaborated, while the other was austere and plain. These registers were linked to modes of performance and verbal genres, but also to major social categories, the types of people who were said to be the main users, the typical users of one or another register. Those categories, those social types were ranked high and low. One of the categories, it's the low one actually, socially low, was of verbal performers, speech specialists, deemed expert in the arts of communication. Call them bards, a bardic category. The people in the other category were mostly farmers or merchants, but this category included the descendants of princes and aristocrats from the pre-colonial kingdoms in Senegal. So we can call them nobles or aristocrats. The registers were named for bards and aristocrats and were thought to be typical of their speech. But it emerged even in my earliest fieldwork that although these differences were talked about in absolute terms, their implementation in actual talk was relative to the situation. It depended on things like who else was present, when and where the talk took place, what the topic was. In a very public setting, involving audiences from all walks of local life, the bards will use the bardic register, the elaborate one, and the aristocrats, the austere aristocrat register, if they speak at all, they're that austere. But in another setting, if only aristocrats are present, the lower ranking aristocrats will speak more elaborately and in a register whose phonology and morphology are sort of bard-like. And so they'll contrast with the more terse, plain speech of the higher ranking aristocrats. So the point is that the contrast between lower and higher rank, between elaborate and austere in talk, still obtains. I noticed this pattern in my first fieldwork. And when Sue and I were writing our book and developing the semiotic concept of fractal recursivity, this Wolof pattern of context-sensitive contrasts struck me as an obvious example. Our semiotic analysis applies to this ethnographic case in other ways too. For example, the linguistic registers were locally seen as acoustic imagery, icons of personality, of temperament. Austerity in talk, so a terse style, low pitch, slow talk. Simple, plain syntax, no emphatics in your morphology and so on. No waving of hands like what I just did. I must be a bard. Anyway, the austerity in talk characterized the aristocrat register and was supposed by the locals to reflect an austere temperament and its self-control. While the contrasting bardic register with its complex morphology and syntax, its fancy lexicon, loudness, high pitch and rapid speech, this was supposed to derive from a flamboyant personality that lacked the control to not do that. That acoustic imagery concerns another part of the semiotic process of differentiation, the one that we call rematization. But where there are differentiations, there are also unifications. When those lower ranking aristocrats and higher ranking aristocrats are assembled in some scene where bards are present too, then lo and behold, the aristocrats are unified. They exhibit behaviors in common as opposed to what the bards are doing. And one can move to a yet wider grouping where the linguistic registers of Wolof come together in contrast with French. So, Sue?
Yeah, well, this strange or apparently strange comparison that we came to brings us to the German-Hungarian bilingual town in Hungary, in southern Hungary. That's our second ethnographic example, where I did fieldwork for a couple of years. People distinguished artisans and farmers as social types. Farmers were said to be ascetic, austere, restrained, actually caring about nothing but accumulating land, otherwise saving money. Artisans were said to be expressive and tending to elaboration in whatever they did, in housing, dress, food, more diverse, fancy, and varied, even in entertainment, even had entertainment, which the farmers did not. The two types were also treated as voices in the two forms of German that speakers used. Locally, these were called different languages, Sprache. These were ways of speaking that anyone could take on. Everyone knew and certainly understood the forms. They involved lexical, phonological, and pragmatic contrasts. And earlier studies by dialectologists had treated these as mere dialects, but, and weirdly, existing in a single town. But in fact, speakers in town presumed the differences signaled important contrasting qualities in the characters and values of the speakers. So ways of speaking seem to depict speakers' character as farmers or artisans. So for instance, artisans had more forms of addressing elders, more elaborate titles. The local speakers heard the artisans as sounding citified. This is what we have called rematization, as Judy just said. And these stereotypes remain strong despite the loss of farming and artisanship during the communist period in Hungary, which shows you the extent to which these were cultural categories, not necessarily tied so strongly to actually making a living. But in addition, people from families from a farming background could and did enact the elaborating voices of artisans when they were among themselves for interactional effects. You wanted to sound ascetic, you wanted to argue against some spending of money. You would argue with a farming voice. If you wanted to argue the opposite. You were among farmers and you wanted to argue about expenditures. You would argue with an artisan voice. And in parallel way, speakers from, I've got this backwards, peoples from farming families, when among only farmers, spoke at times like artisans, and people from artisan families, when speaking only with artisans, spoke sometimes as farmers, usually for interactional effects or for humor, for parody, and lots of other kinds of effects. So this came to mind right away when Judy and I were developing the concept of fractal recursivity and writing our book as a possible example of that. The differences from Wolof case are also important. So they were not identical, these two cases. People in the German-Hungarian town in Hungary denied any hierarchy between artisans and farmers, especially in politics. Unlike the Wolof case, these bilinguals claimed equal ranking for rich farmers and artisans. And in fact, they ignored even the existence of poor people, which is another aspect of differentiation, the erasure that we've talked about. So these German speakers in Hungary were part of a migrant population. Their ancestors arrived in Hungary in the 18th century, understanding themselves as colonizers. As a result, they were targets of political demands made by Hungarian and German nationalists in the mid-20th century, basically around the World War and before. German nationalists saw them as potential Nazi allies, and Hungarian nationalists saw them often as alien interlopers. So this is an encompassing fractal in which the Hungarians combined the migrant populations with all Germans and thought of them as foreigners, as against Hungarians. And this despite the minorities who were citizens in Hungary after several hundred years of peaceful and constructive coexistence with Hungarians. I want to say other Hungarians because they felt themselves to be that. So how the bilinguals dealt with these pressures and the effects on their own stereotypes and their practices changed. So did the Cold War and Hungary's entry into the EU, which opened opportunities for German speakers to travel westward, as they had not in the communist period, and to use their linguistic skills for gainful work. Tracking these changes showed how standard languages got swept up into the town system of differentiation. The town itself actually fit comparisons. They were neither city nor village. It was a fractally shifting unit for residents, depending on what they compared themselves to. Were they a village compared to cities? Were they a town compared to villages? Finally, erasure has played quite a dramatic role. In the 20th century, there was no official legal identity category in Hungary for these speakers as bilinguals. Their Hungarian speech, though very fluent and very standard, identified them as foreigners, perhaps because it was a little too standard, to Hungarian monolinguals. But as German dialect speakers, they also sounded foreign to Germans when they traveled to Germany, as speaking a very strange and unfamiliar dialect. So this caused enormous emotional and political distress for many people. There was a great irony in being excluded from both national categories, both national groups, yet feeling loyal to both languages, as many did because they had grown up with both languages. And this distressing configuration is not unusual for migrants globally, I want to emphasize. The next section of our book is about semiotics again. And having exemplified how the differentiation process works in our ethnographies, I bet you're all thinking, so why care about semiotics? I mean, why care about this abstract model since we already understand the ethnography? So here are some ways of thinking about this that we came up with. We do this because sign relations are the armatures of social life. You don't see them as separate, but they hold up the edifice. Remember the black coat. Or sign relations are like the colors that constitute a plaid fabric. You can't separate the colors from the plaid, but there would be no plaid without the colors. So the signs, like armature or colors, actually constitute the organization of the social world we perceive, and in particular, they organize the differentiation of that world. Once we see the organizational principles, you can better discern why and how people are persuaded by or take for granted or act in response to sign relations, to value regimes, to ideological work. And you can see the many empirical forms that this process and its aspects take. It's also worth emphasizing that that means the speakers, the observers, the conjecturers, we actually make the sign relations that we notice. I think this is quite different from what we usually think of in linguistic anthropology. So we connect the signs to what they might indicate as indexical signs in contiguity and what they might depict as iconic signs. Right? So we make the connections between the signs and what they depict and point to. Yet our work of doing so is erased. It seems as though the signs stand separate from us, but they're not. It is evident when we see how this works in chains of conjectures, building on each other, that we are immediately involved in what these sign relations are. So here's an example. Suppose you're walking down on a nice morning, you're walking down your street in the city, and you notice a dark spot. These are not exactly made up. I actually went through this, but it is kind of like a thought experiment. You notice a dark spot on the pavement. Is it paint? The grass on the lawn next to the spot seems wet. Maybe both spots are wetness. If so, they're icons. They're similar to each other. What could the wetness be a sign of, you wonder? What caused it? What is its index? Perhaps rain from earlier in the day, or kids playing with water balloons, or the neighbors sprinkling the lawn. If it's the neighbors, and that's your guess, your hypothesis, if it's the neighbor's sprinkler and there is a drought, then you might disapprove of sprinkling the sidewalk. So the sprinkling would index for you the thoughtlessness of your neighbor. And that judgment is also, it turns out, an indexical sign of you, suggesting that you are an environmentalist. You care about that. But if you then realize, wait, it wasn't water at all on the pavement, it was just a spot of paint, then you would have to recalibrate, revise. Right? Notice how fast the logic of conjecturing goes from a spot on the pavement to neighbors and to political stances like environmentalism. Yet people with different starting points using the same impeccable semiotic logic could end up with different judgments. And that's what we're interested in, the making of different worlds by the same semiotics. However, all the sign activity is not yet differentiation. For that, we asked, how do people do comparison with sign relations? These are more complicated to conjecture. It involves creating axes of differentiation with signs, projecting rematization, fractal recursivity, and erasure. So in order to give an example of this, to get deeply into it so people could grasp exactly what we're trying to talk about, we carefully read the writings of a woman named Anne Royale, who lived from 1760s to 1850s, whose husband was a Revolutionary War hero in Virginia in the US. After his death, she did a lot of publishing about her travels, where she went from Virginia to Alabama, then to Boston and back in the first decades of the 19th century. She relied on the discourses of her time, which were environmental determinism and largely nationalism. The idea for us was to see how written materials could reveal something that our ethnographies had not talked about much, which was spatial differentiation. And I think, dialectologists and so on care about this quite a bit. And so do we. On a stagecoach ride from the West, Anne Royale looked out from the top of the Appalachian Mountains, you all might be familiar with this, the Appalachian Mountains, some of you, to the Atlantic Ocean, and characterized the scenery and the people that she thought she saw. She said, nature to the east, quote, was small, the land is thin, the animals diminutive, the people full of effrontery and impudence. They speak fast and say nothing. They're concerned only with themselves, unquote. Then she looked to the West and she said, the people of the West, which is where she was from, she said, are big. Nature is rich, luxuriant, and bold. The people stout, modest, unassuming. They speak slowly, saying little, and they're all generous. Now here she has created an axis of differentiation that organizes a whole bunch of qualities that actually for us might not fit together, but for her they did, and projected these axes onto landscape, animals, and people's speech and demeanor. So a puzzle came up for us. How could these really ontologically different things, landscape, people, demeanor, speech, how could they all be incorporated into a single contrast? For her as a West Virginia resident, East and West were not compass points. In her perspective, they were equally contrasting imagined unity. The phenomena on each side resembled each other. They were iconic of each other, as opposed to qualities on the other side. And it's rematization that makes such images, entities, and categories seem self-evident. Right? It wasn't just the people who were big, it was a landscape that was big. And people create origin stories, rematizing narratives to explain the characteristics and qualities that they themselves are conjecturing, putting together. Usually they also posit unseen forces or causes for the differences. Sometimes these are environmental or they are inner organs. Royale said that the stories of, she told stories of big-hearted Westerners and small-minded Easterners, which are internal to the people. Right? We call it rematization, as you might wonder, because ream is what Peirce called the signs where conjectures recast the sign relations from indexical to ironic, to iconic, right? The contrast of qualities that Anne Royale picked out between big and small, that for her distinguished East and West, were reapplied by her just to those things that were in the East, so as to subdivide them, which is what we've been calling fractal recursions, into another East and West, now all within the previous East. She did the same for the West. So she went to New York and she found the people there unassuming, simple, modest, and generous, unlike snobby Philadelphia, where she'd been before. So she declared that New York was just like the West and felt like home. So she created the East-West inside the East. And she did the same for things in the West. And we call another fractal move she made, and many people did too, was to unify all of the United States, so what she called East and West, all together as wild, modest people with no aristocracy, while Europe remained the East, tame landscape, arrogant, hierarchical people. They did have aristocracy. This is what we call an encompassing recursion. Think of the huge amount of erasure involved in making categories like East and West, ignoring variations in climate and people, or in racial and gender categories. For Anne Royale, it required erasing Eastern people who were not arrogant. Surely there were some. And Eastern animals that were not small. Surely there were some of those too. You might wonder, why are we calling this a fractal? And this is to recall self-similar fractal structures in geometry. But the truth is that microcosm inside macrocosm is a very ancient idea. And in anthropology, segmentary systems of kinship have also described processes like these. Ours is a little different because it's a single process of differentiation that involves other things as other aspects of the process. And I should also say, because this will occur to many people, that recursions are not always dichotomies, nor are dichotomies, by the way, our idea or imposition. They seem important and common in all of the world, as figure-ground relations, as deictics such as I and you, for instance. But the key point is how self-evident the categories become once they are on an axis, as though they existed independent of our conjecturing. Axes of differentiation, of course, change historically. In the book, we tracked how the East-West distinction in the US that Royale talked about was transformed into the more famous North-South difference in the South in the course of the 19th century. And we have a whole chapter that shows how the label Yankee was transformed into many different things in the course of the century. And differentiations are also very efficaciously created inside organizations as factions and political parties, in contrast and sometimes opposition, as we might have noticed recently in the United States, ones in which people's expressive forms seem to signal their contrasting characteristics, qualities, and their values, as also, however, open to fractal recursion. Judy?
Okay, I'm going to go a little bit more concrete, I guess, or at least methodological. In the next section of the book, we ask, where is ideological work located? And to address this question, we develop a concept of site, a site of ideological work, and we pursue the ways a site links to other sites. Following those links takes you onto wider analytical scales, and that made us start thinking about the concept of scale itself. What are scales? How are scales made? But first, the methodological questions. In doing research, where do you look to see ideological work? And what research strategies can help you find it, observe it, track it? Ideological work involves attention and the semiotic activity that flows from it. So for example, imagine a city street. A few people are passing by, they're minding their own business. Then somebody stops, puts on a funny hat, takes out some objects and begins to juggle them. Some of the passers-by stop to watch. So suddenly we have a new scene with new activity and new uptake, because the passers-by shift from civil inattention to focused attention on the performer. There's uptake. Maybe they say something to each other or to the performer. Maybe after a while, the performer puts the hat on the ground and the other people, now constituted as audience, the other people put coins in the hat. Maybe people talk about the juggling afterwards, evaluating whether it was well done, whether it's a good sign of civil society in public spaces and the kind of thing that will attract tourists. Or is it a sign of unemployment and poverty, that people like the juggler can't make a living and are reduced to scrounging for pennies. And what does the juggler himself think? All this reflects ideological work by participants who have varied points of view. Now, we've probably all seen this sort of thing. There's nothing special about this example. In principle, anything can be an object of joint attention, and when it is, it's a site of ideological work and can be investigated as such. After all, paying attention to something means contrasting it with its surroundings as figure and ground, and it means some form of cognizing. Is there a label or expression for this? Are there other things like it? What's it like? What do you do with it or about it, if anything? What's the uptake? How do you evaluate it in comparison to its surroundings or to other things? Do such evaluations and uptakes differ from one observer to another? What is not said? What's left out of some people's attention, uptake, or commentary? Well, we follow the object of attention, that is the site, and the activity that surrounds it and flows from it to see what people say about the object of attention, if anything, whether people differ in what they say, what the uptakes are or the refusals of uptake, who's doing what. And we call this method a centerpiece approach because it starts from an object of attention and tracks semiotic activity and participants outward, branching rhizome-like. We're attending to points of view, differences, and the contrasts and boundaries people create or invoke. Now, 2 chapters in the book illustrate this approach. They start from everyday objects of attention. I keep saying objects of attention rather than just objects to emphasize that you don't have to be looking at physical things. An object of attention might be an utterance, for example, or a melody. One of the centerpiece sites that we followed is a bench at a bus stop in the city of Baltimore. In the 1990s, many such benches, we saw them, were inscribed with the slogan, "Baltimore, the city that reads." We saw lots of snarky comments and mock slogans like "Baltimore, the city that bleeds," and "Baltimore, the city with delusional park benches." Well, we tracked what people did with the benches, what they said about the slogan in various media, who produced these media, the history of the bench inscriptions through several city administrations, the ones that installed the slogans, that repaired or more likely failed to repair the benches, that changed the slogans, that still failed to repair the benches, and so on. Tracking this semiotic activity and history led us very quickly to people's ideologized claims about reading and literacy. Remember what the slogan was, the city that reads. This in turn led to differences in point of view between insiders and outsiders. That is, between people who had a long-term investment in the city and people who were or considered themselves visitors or short-term residents. And from there, we were led into Baltimore's often fraught race relations. The links among sites even took us outside the city, into the suburbs and into the comparisons people drew between Baltimore and other American cities, which were often seen as better, but that evaluation is itself positioned. So the semiotic trail went wide, eventually involving history, demography, politics, regional relations. It very quickly led to race relations and attitudes, and to local and even national politics, because a contender for the Democratic nomination in 2016 for president had been mayor of Baltimore and was responsible for one of the slogans on these benches. These chapters show how the semiotic activities in a site branch outward, leading to other sites, and how these branching relations engage regimes of value, social differentiations, and different perspectives on linguistic practices and the social world. The branchings with all the contrasts and the relations across boundaries that are involved in them are what's important. It's a feature of this research strategy that you don't begin by drawing a boundary around what you want to investigate and then looking inside it. There's no notion of a bounded universe of data, because boundaries and the relations across them are exactly what you're concerned with. Implicit in this research strategy are changes in scale, and scale is the focus of the third chapter in this section of the book. Scale is implicit in the centerpiece method because you're working outward from particulars to wider networks of linked sites and social relations. But scalar judgments are interesting in themselves as sites of ideological work. People make scalar judgments all the time, and in fact, many languages have scalar evaluations built into the grammar and comparative constructions. This sweater is green, that one is greener. This restaurant is good, that one's better, this other one is the best. Such scalar judgments depend on the point of view of the person doing the judging, and that person might like that restaurant more than I do. Our book also explores some ways scale is thought of in the social sciences and the natural sciences too. There we see kinds of scaling that purport to be far removed from human decision-making and differences of opinion, such as the metric system for measuring distances and quantities. Progress in science, whether natural science or social science, has sometimes been measured, notice scale again, in terms of how distanced its framework is from any personal or local or context-specific judgment. But scales are made by people. And that's something that can get obscured when a scale-making project, such as the metric system, gets institutionalized and widely promulgated. And some of these issues even pertain to the last section of the book on linguistic science in the 19th century. Sue?
Yeah, very much so. So scaling turned out to be important in our historical investigations, and especially this view from nowhere, which I'll kind of get back to. So our contribution in this section of the book in thinking about the history of linguistics is based on new archival historical material, as well as material that we had each worked on. And in particular, we approached 19th century linguistics at a slant. We wanted to see it from the scholarly activity of the periphery of the discipline, not from what has been written many, many times as the, Whiggish inevitable evolution of linguistics as a discipline. So we approached it as a slant from the periphery. And ultimately, our point is that the methodological issues and some of the wrong-headed universalist ambitions of linguistics that first emerged in the 19th century are still with us, and they're still problematical. Much of formalist linguistics, for instance, continues to rely on intuition, on single informants, and to set aside or actually ignore certain kinds of variation and social context. And we asked, what are the ideological roots of this erasure? So two questions framed our work in this historical section. First, how did the presumptions with which linguists approached their materials, whether they were Africanists or Europeanists, how did they shape the kinds of analyses that they produced? And second, how did the same social presumptions influence linguists' own position, that is the sociology of linguistics, the rankings and interactions in the emerging field of professional linguistics in the late 19th century? And as we discovered both these aspects, the lives of linguists on the one hand, their professional lives, and their descriptions were organized according to our semiotic principles, surprise. And in the process we found, to our pleasant surprise, really, it was quite amazing. It's another case of convergence, that some of the people we had each written about separately might well have known each other in the small world of linguistics, professional linguistics at the time. So for instance, a Hungarian linguist of German background, Untitled Chapter, And the Englishman, Robert Needham Cust, might actually have met and talked in Berlin in 1881 at the 5th Annual Orientalist Congress. We located them as having stayed in the same hotel. We couldn't quite find out, which table they sat at when they talked, but we did locate them in the same hotel and thought about what the world might have looked like to them. So of course, as a prelude, I should say, it's easier to see the ideological commitments of other scholarly of our scholarly ancestors than our own. So we focus on our ancestors, not on ourselves. Those who studied language presumed that languages are bounded wholes arrayed on territory. Because such spatial distributions were supposed to be free of human will, they could justify political claims and often did. The categories they were supposed to explain, language structures and their distribution across territory, were things like race, difference, geography, language families, progress, a civilization ranking of speakers. Because the ideological shaping of linguistic description is maybe more familiar from our earlier work, both jointly and separately, let me start with professional lives. Cust was a colonial administrator and wrote about African and Indian languages as part of organizing British rule. He was outraged that there was only a single session at the Oriental Congresses for African languages, only one for the entire continent, and that one was focused on Egypt. Hunfalvi, for his side, wrote about the little peoples, as they call them, of Siberia, those that were identified as Finno-Ugric and so presumed to be related to Hungarian and Finnish, and he was a Hungarian citizen. And he was outraged particularly at Max Müller, the most prestigious linguist at the Congresses, who claimed that these languages of Siberia were primitive. Müller ranked them this way because he claimed that they had no family relationships, not socially, not linguistically. They just wandered around as nomads in some, who knows what he imagined. So Cust and Hunfalvi were marginalized as scholars. Their objects of analysis were marginalized. What they studied were in fact ignored, erased, demoted, or totally excluded from the center of 19th century linguistics. But interestingly, this exclusion turned out to be a large problem for the ambitions of the discipline as a whole. 19th century linguists wanted to create a universal theory of language, an objective view from nowhere that would describe and explain all human languages as part of a single overarching framework. And of course, the kinds of things they had in mind as explanations were race, evolution, geography, rankings of various kinds. To scale the discipline's purview up to universal, they needed all the languages of the world. It was a delicious irony. The leading German and French linguists, the center of the discipline, found that to upscale their science of linguistics into universals, they had to pay attention to the little people of Siberia and to African languages, as well as to the rural dialects of Europe. Even more ironic, they had to listen to the missionaries and administrators like Cust, who analyzed African languages, and to those outside the West European academic hierarchy, like Hunfalvi, who actually had no prestigious official training in linguistics, although he was a good linguist. But there was also, so that was one kind of problem for linguists. There was also a methodological problem. How to describe unwritten languages of tribal Siberia or Africa. The practical problem was the lack of mechanical recording and the limits of hand transcription processes. We have field workers, I happen to know the ones from Siberia, complaining about how their hands got really, really tired trying to write down what people said, but at the same time, they complained, people could not speak slowly enough for them to be able to write it down. So there was a limit of the hand transcription process. The intellectual problem was greater. that the only analytical tools they had were those of classical and biblical philology. And relying on philology, linguistics presumed clear language boundaries, ignored variation. After all, the philologists were usually working on single texts, relating them to previous ones. They worked, the field linguist, with single informants and created corpuses by choosing bounded speech genres, proverbs, rituals, short, easily decontextualizable text. No improvisation, no extended speech entered the corpuses. This, of course, limited what could be analyzed. Now, of course, not all West European linguists took the same view of unwritten languages. Only the centralized ones, right? The ones at the center of the discipline. Hugo Schuhart, for instance, who was hardly at the center, fought against race-based categorizations and dismissed neo-grammarians' focus on boundaries. He insisted that all languages are mixed, he called them, and urged a methodology that would focus on creoles, on dialect chains, and on spoken language in ordinary life, like the slang of soldiers, for instance, in an integrated Habsburg army, and the work of shopkeepers, the cross influences of multilingualism in the Habsburg Empire. Similarly, Georg Wencker, the European dialectologist, rejected dialect boundaries on the basis of empirical evidence and because national ideology at his particular time period encouraged him to look for national unities, not regional ones. So much for the linguist's professional lives. The second prong of this chapter is a close look at how the processes of differentiation constrained linguistic descriptions. The Hungarian and Finnish linguists who went to Siberia were not driven merely by the goal of describing languages. Though they were funded by the Russian Academy of Sciences, it is fair to say that they were there to locate Finno-Ugric speaking kin, speakers who were posited as their kin, herders and fishers, whose languages were related to theirs in the going theory of language relation. The Hungarians wanted to find the kind of tribal myths and rituals that Western Europeans had said they found to anchor national ambitions. And the linguists, Castrain, the great Finnish-Swedish linguist, is one of the famous ones, Reguli and Humfalvi, the Hungarians, did indeed find in Serbian peoples the characteristics they understood to be features of their own European national stereotypes. So you see rematization working here. Hungarians found aggressive, brave, martial people with warrior myths, and the Finns found calm, peaceful, and hardworking folk. And these were very much the qualities that supposedly differentiated among the Finno-Ugric languages and peoples of Europe. So the Siberian findings were a kind of fractal recursion and erasure as well. Now, the African materials, the process of semiotic differentiation was also evident, but in different ways. Judy?
Yes, I'll try to be a bit quick on this because I know that we're running late. A major problem in African linguistics at the time was how some global differentiation of populations and culture, especially a contrast between primitive simplicity and civilizational complexity, could be made to fit African languages and their speakers. You can think of this as a problem in semiotic recursivity. If you think that this contrast between primitive and complex applies globally, then how does it apply more locally? What made the problem so difficult at that time was that no single factor seemed to differentiate and rank all the languages consistently. Many scholars focused on race, but then they quarreled as to whether skin color, hair form, or skeletal structures were race's most important signs, and why linguistic structures did or didn't match. Other scholars focused less on racial specifics, so some looked more to religion, detecting, for instance, the evil influence of Islam on God-given original languages. Still, other researchers emphasized family systems, so they supposed that grammatical gender systems in language must be a reflection of domestic gender relations in African societies, or any societies. And since European languages had grammatical gender, then recursively, any African languages that did as well must be higher, perhaps whiter, than those that didn't have grammatical gender, along with their speakers, regardless of otherwise observable skin color or hair form. And some scholars found African linguistic and cultural analogs of the rival European powers, again, recursively. So German scholars found Little Germany in Africa with its forests and its tall, brave inhabitants, as opposed to the supposedly lazy and cowardly inhabitants of the neighboring French-dominated zone. Well, it would be a mistake to think that none of this 19th century work had the slightest value as documentation or value in the later intellectual history of linguistics. But it would equally be a mistake to think that all the problems have gone away, even if linguistics has abandoned conspicuous racial or evolutionary scales. Anyway, some of the grand issues remain important. Debates about variability and what it means, about the relationships of peoples and populations to linguistic practices, and about the methods for studying and defining languages, even language itself as a human capacity. These debates continue to engage the discipline.
Well, we've taken you on a lightning tour of a rather long and complicated book.
Lightning, should have been more lightning, I guess.
I know, a slow lightning. We'll just conclude, as we do in the book, by hoping that you will find our methods and analytical approaches interesting, provocative, maybe something to argue with even, and useful for developing your own ideas and projects about related matters. And thank you so much for listening, for hanging around with us for this presentation. And maybe the changing between Judy and me was kind of like a PowerPoint.
Okay.
Yeah. Many thanks.
Thank you so very much, Susan and Judith, for a veritable tour de force of your book. So I'll just yield the digital floor now to Sinfree to pose a couple of questions to you, and invite colleagues in the audience to kindly post their questions and comments as well. Sinfree.
Okay, thank you very much, Susan and Judith. This was a fascinating talk. I've read your work over the years, and I think it has shaped some of my own ideas for better or for worse. But I want to get into the conversation by quoting, by citing a quotation that I came across as I was preparing for your talk from an article written by a Bulgarian scholar called Nigel Kakov, and he writes as follows: "We will not succeed if we continue to read only Western writers or only writers from the non-West who enter into our debates on our terms. We will not succeed if we remain within the comfort zone of any civilization into which we happen to be born." So what is always interesting about both your work is how you transcend, let's say, moving away from the United States into different parts of the world, into another completely different civilizations, and then coming back again to the US and American sociolinguistics or anthropological context. But I want to begin with that at the back of my mind. I want to begin with a very parochial question. Your presentation was well synchronized, but the question that I have is this: what are the unsaid differences between your views which have become clear over time? which one can't pick up from reading your work, but which the two of you are able to detect when you are discussing? What are the subtle differences which you have between yourselves, which remain unresolved, even though you've collaborated over a long period of time?
Oh, that's really a hard one.
That is a hard one. Monkey wrench, a monkey wrench.
I really don't know how to answer that. I mean, surely the fact that we've worked in very different places, and the different places are themselves engaged with different linguistic and social theories. And that leads to at least a difference in kinds of expertise, let's put it that way, between us.
Yeah. I think it's also important that we have gotten interested simultaneously with our projects in very different sorts of things. So, I mean, as an example, I've gotten interested in processes of translation, but Judy has gotten interested in a more in-depth view of African historical material. Or I do very little on colonialism. Or my work on colonialism is a weirdly different one. That is German colonies inside Europe, right? Whereas Judy, I think, works much more actively on overseas colonies. So I think there's a process of we're inspiring each other. I started thinking about colonies in Russia, right? German colonies, as a result of thinking about Judy's work in Africa. Right? So I think, I think where we study has a huge amount of effect, as Judy said, on how we have developed, and also what it is that the people we're working with are interested in.
Because also the people that I worked with in my early field work were very interested in history. I mean, I already was too, but they were interested at a level of when a history-oriented program came on the radio, these young guys would turn up the volume and say, "Now that's something interesting," which was a surprise coming from an American context.
And I have one other thing that that I have become interested in, and Judy might too, but my interest in it has been as a result not only of my own experience, but also the people that I'm working with, which has to do with political discourses about gender.
Okay.
And the fight, and it really is now becoming a very heated thing, that the fight between gender and anti-gender in discourses that have effects on the very same things that we're talking about, but we did not work them out in this book, but I hope to work them out in some other work. So that's a kind of politics that I think is actually becoming important in Africa, but has been going on for some 30 years in Europe at this point for local reasons.
Yeah, it's interesting you're saying that. When I'm writing with one of my co-authors, with Alistair Pennycook, where we fundamentally disagree is on issues relating to this linguistic theory about integrationistic linguistics. He has never openly said so, but he's very impatient with it, and I like it quite a lot. So what we do, the politics of our relationship, is we dance around that particular area. I'll get back and write about it with somebody else. But when we're writing together, we sort of diplomatically avoid having to engage with each other on that topic, because otherwise there's no progress that is made. That's why I was because I think we fundamentally disagree. But I guess one of these days we'll write a book called The Pro and Anti-Integrationist Reconciliation. But that's another time. That's a project for another time. then I want to ask you something else that came into my mind as I was preparing to respond to your talk. And I'm going to read this. This is from this is a quotation from Cecile Canut, whose work I like quite a lot, whose work you know quite a lot as well. And she writes this: "It must be admitted that the major epistemological changes stemming from the affirmation that the concept of language is not a datum of reality, but the result of political categorization." Now, my question is, what do you think about that particular statement? And what are the implications of thinking about language not as a datum of reality, but as a result of political categorization?
Oh,
Well, I have actually thought and even written about that at some length and continue to do so.
Okay, good.
Because
Mhm.
I have been very interested in how it came about that
Mhm.
that in scholarship on matters linguistic in Africa, that
Mhm.
certain ways of speaking were identified as a language different
Yes.
from the next one and the next
Mhm.
one, and what the politics were that
Mhm.
were involved in that. Who did what
Mhm.
in that um, in producing those supposed object things as if they were things on the ground and realities. And lately I have been trying to do historical work on how that worked for isiZulu,
Mhm.
for example, but I have tried to do that. I've looked at other cases as well, in Nigeria in particular, simply because of the usefulness of archives
Mhm.
for Nigerian linguistics in the 19th century.
Mhm.
so I should add
Mhm.
that I too have been working on this for quite a long time, and
Mhm.
for me, the challenge is that
Mhm.
Europe is the place where supposedly there
Mhm.
are the bounded languages that were imposed everywhere else, right?
Mhm.
And in fact, Europe is a terrible example of bounded languages. I mean, one of the first things you discover in actually living in and working around Europe is the extent to which dialect chains are everywhere. And even the supposed great Romance and Germanic boundaries are nothing of the sort. That is, people who are actually living them only do so as connected to a standardizing school-related form that people actually reject in their everyday lives. I mean, look at English, for instance, in England, not to mention in the United States. So I think that it's very clear that what Cecile says is absolutely the case. That is, that these are politically disciplined, and people get punished very seriously. And now I'm talking about Europe, very seriously for not abiding by standardized languages. Hungarian is one of those languages that is so strictly standardized that even someone with an accent, such as the people I work with, or myself, for instance, are remarked and ostracized as not speaking properly, whereas in other places less stringently standardized, it would never even be noticed. So I do think that this is absolutely true, and I have been working on it. And I should say that Hugo Schuhart, that I mentioned, is one of the people who was working very hard on exactly these things. He was appalled by the direction that standard linguistics, that mainstream linguistics went in the direction of analyzing standardized languages that had boundaries. And of course, Judy and I have been writing about how the boundaries themselves are made by negotiation, usually around political boundaries. Like Dutch and German?
Mm, mm, mm.
As my German friends say, I won't embarrass them by repeating what they say about Dutch.
The argument of languages as bounded and as some extent a product of colonial engagement in African scholarship raises a lot of political problems for the argument that Ngugi wa Thiong'o makes, for example. If his argument is that we should, he writes in Kikuyu, is that is his mother tongue, whatever, But if Kikuyu is a product of colonial invention, etc., what he's done, he has got himself tied up in a very complicated process where he's arguing passionately for a colonial artifact. But I guess we're all a contradiction. Because on the one hand, you sympathize with his interests, but you can see that conceptually, he has got himself tied up in the colonial discourse that he's seeking to move away from. Anyway, let me stop here so that I can open up other people. Basi, we can always come back for further engagement. Yes.
May I say just one thing? So I understand, and I have thought about actually Ngugi's problem, as you put it.
Yes.
But this is a problem that has a similarity to minority languages, for
Yes.
instance, in Europe, but everywhere, indigenous languages. Should we standardize? And
Yeah.
if so, look what happens. We create boundaries.
Yes.
But at the same time, what they say in response, and I have said this, and people have argued with me, and they say states do not recognize anything other than standardized language, right? And so there is this other side to it of having to interact with states and therefore compromise ourselves in our theoretical understanding.
Yes.
Anyway,
Yes, with Ngugi, you get the impression that in order for him to make his case, he needed to fetishize the idea of his first language in order to make the case. It's more or less like he needed to erase certain aspects about the history of Kikuyu in order to make the case. Anyway, Basi.
Thanks a lot, Sinfi. Thanks, Suzanne and Judith. As you'll see from the comments, you have a huge fan base here. As you've been speaking, your work has been described severally as incredible, breathtaking, inspiring. So many colleagues have been inspired by your work. Cecile has a question. Cecile would like you to elaborate on the processes at play to render ideologized visions convincing. In other words, what processes are at play that make it possible to render ideologized visions in a convincing manner? And he further asks, how does this take place? To whom and for what purposes? I wonder if who would like to go first?
Since you started before. Yeah.
What? Oh, go ahead, Sue. Sorry.
Well, I'll start, but Judy will have plenty to say too. Is this Cecile? Is that who, right?
Yes.
I just want to know. It's Cecile. Yes. Okay.
This is Vigo.
This is the other one, Vigo.
Hello.
Oh, it's this Cecile. Hi. So thank you for that question. I think it's great. I would go first of all to remitization, and to the fact that remitization works in two directions. That is, it sometimes stereotypes about the people who are understood to speak the language, or the linguistic form, let us say, since we just problematized language. So the people who are understood to be speaking that linguistic form, whether or not they actually do. Okay. So there can start out to be a person stereotype, and that person stereotype is projected onto their forms of speech, and then the forms of speech are used as evidence for, look, this is what they are like because we see that they speak this way. And vice versa, it can also work in the other direction. That is, I notice there's something about the speech of one or more such people, but we're talking about the creation of stereotypes that precedes this often. And this can be projected onto the people who do the speaking. So what we have developed is the notion that this projection is a very widespread phenomenon. And we know that in the United States, the attempts to dissociate forms of speaking from social group stereotypes has been an ongoing and not very successful phenomenon. Right? This continues to work because of the understanding that the indexical relation between me and my speech can be turned into an iconic relation, that there's a similarity between me and my speech. And of course, there are all sorts of questions like, what do you pick out about the speech? And what do you pick out about the person type that you can put together as pictures of each other? And that is a question of social stereotyping.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Which is then strengthened, helped along, shaped by the linguistic aspect. So I think, I think that's something that we really do contribute to with this notion of rematization and the predilection of people to put together indexical and iconic signs.
Right. Yeah, that's the putting together that I would kind of emphasize, because when we're talking about an axis of differentiation, one of the things that does is it bundles together all sorts of different kinds of signs as signs of a similar contrast. And that means that in terms of stereotypes, one can pick on one piece of it as evidence for another piece. So one kind of behavior as evidence for another part of the package, because it is assumed that the packages go together. And it's difficult, although it happens that the packages shift, but it's difficult to, as a single person, to make that happen. It ends up being a longer historical process of for such shifts.
Let me add what Judy just said reminded me. I mean, this is what we do. We talk to each other and we bounce off, which is that it's never only one stereotype and never only one form of speech. And so one always has to ask, okay, if one set of people are actually often derogated by the speech that they are associated with, that is simultaneously raising another group. And so it's the raising and derogating that are going together, or at least the distinguishing, but of course it often ends up being a derogation as well. So the two, because axes of differentiation make distinctions, right, producing one and another group with a certain qualities of self and speech, it's that connection and comparison that one needs to break if you want to change it, but that's what fixes the relationship.
Okay, thank you very much. I know Sally Coco Mufene needs to run along now. I wonder if he's still there. He had a question for you both.
Maybe he left it in the chat.
No. Okay. Sally, are you there? Okay, he's probably left. Okay. Before I come to Rebecca, there's a question from Daniel. Daniel says that they have a question about marginalization and erasure. Daniel writes from Brazil, and the question is around the kinds of local / native scholarly contributions. So Daniel asks, what kinds of local scholarly contributions count for field workers? Which native scholars, if any, get cited in ethnographies of native groups? Daniel recalls reading an ethnography about the Ashanika of the Amazon as being silent about violence and trauma. The field worker didn't cite a single Peruvian or Brazilian scholar. And yet, there are many ethnographies where Ashanika speak extensively of trauma with South American field workers. So it seems like silence there was interactional. And Daniel wonders about the role of erasure in this citational or publishing practices.
Well,
It's going on. It's going on.
surely this this depends a good deal on who is producing this ethnography of some native group, and what do they think is, who do they think it's important to talk to? Who do they think it's important to listen to, perhaps more importantly, or to read? There are many discussions about citation practices in anthropology and in other fields. Gender in citation practices is one that has loomed large in these discussions. But of course, it's not only that. There's much about the native ethnographer, about race, and so on. And I have always taken this problem to heart as something that is important, having heard many people give talks in which, as another example of that, in which they claimed the so-and-sos, whatever group they're talking about, the so-and-sos believe or say X. And then if you were so bold as to ask them who they talked to, it turns out to be, they talk to prominent men in their 50s, and since when are those the so-and-so, the whoever, especially if the claim is something about the whole population or other parts of the population or whatever. So I think one cannot generalize about scholars in this way, just as you don't want the scholars to generalize about the natives. These have been contentious matters.
Let me add something. I mean, I agree with what Judy has just said. I think that's really important. I would like to add that one of the things we've been trying very hard to impress upon ourselves and as we write, and also our readers, is that the differentiation process has these various aspects. Erasure all by itself is not the whole deal. And that means that I would ask the authors, the ethnographers that Daniel is citing, what about the other aspects of differentiation? So this goes to what Judy was saying. Who are you differentiating yourself from? Who are you differentiating among the people you're writing about? Erasure happens as part of differentiation. And it's often enlightening because you don't notice that, oh, I know that something's missing, but what is the differentiation? What is the axis of differentiation? Whether it's age, race, gender, that allows you to erase certain speakers and not others, right? And remetize some of them as perhaps knowing more, and so on. So we are always urging people to think of the entire process of differentiation, not erasure by itself. Although erasure is fetching.
I know that we've talked a lot, and I just thought of something that I should have said when I was speaking here, which is that one of the arguments that we have made is that there is no hard and fast line in terms of interpretation between what a researcher does and what the people the researcher is studying do. That everyone is engaged in interpreting what's going on in their social surroundings all the time. You bring different things to the encounter, but there's not some sort of magic window that or partition that says, here they are, and here we researchers are doing something, entirely different, different sort of intellectual equipment for doing it. No, we don't think of it that way. So,
which is why the whole process is relevant to the investigator as well as the people who are.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Rebecca?
Oh yeah. Thank you so much. Great talk. Really quick. The quick question that I had was, I don't know which one of you talked about the ways people were speaking was related to was actually depicting the character of the speaker. So I was wondering if you can see, because in my own research, one thing that I've noticed is that sometimes I'm researching a lot more of a technology kind of area. And so one thing that I've noticed is that sometimes the speaker with some expertise speak in a certain way. So I was wondering if you, do you think that there's a connection between the way of speaking, maybe language, and then expertise of someone in a specific domain? So that's the first question. The other question that I wanted to ask you was about grammatization. Is grammatization only about stereotyping folks? And also, you have a word that a new concept that's new to me, fractal recursivity. So, do you mind a little word on that? I think that will be all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I'll start, Judy, okay? Or you can, okay. Well, I think expertise is almost always, I would say always, a matter, at least in part, of speaking. That is, expertise is enacted. It's not enough to say to people, oh yeah, I know how to do that. I'm an expert in that. And then to proceed without any special vocabulary, without any special ways of speaking. So I think Summerson Carr has written a really terrific piece in the Annual Review of Anthropology, making the argument that I just made. That is that it's not a matter of having expertise and knowing things, it's a matter of how you enact the expertise, which always involves language in the first place, that is ways of speaking, but often also other kinds of semiotic modalities, how you hold the stethoscope or how you, whatever is involved in expertise. So yes, I really think that that's very important. And actually it's a differentiation between those who hold the expertise and those who do not. But just to get to your question about fractal recursivity, among those who hold the expertise and know how to enact it, there are some who do it different. There's some who do it
more so,
exactly, more so, or who do it less like those who don't have it. They do it more like those who do have it, right? So there's a range of, there's always somebody in a world of expertise who's not taken to be quite as expert as everyone else,
right?
In that world. And that's where fractal recursivity comes in. So you take a distinction like amateur expert, and you make the same distinction among experts. And let me tell you, it happens all the time.
Right.
And it doesn't much matter, even linguists, and it doesn't much matter what the expertise is. There are always internal differentiations made, and those two depend on enactments.
Yes, and if I could add to that, expertise is learned, and therefore there's a socialization process that goes on with it, and that can include all kinds of conventions about how you speak, about what's appropriate, about how you speak inside a lab, how you speak to a wider public in various genres of speaking performance. But it's something that that people have to acquire, and in so acquiring, they are presumably the ones who acquire it well are paying special attention to the ones within that community who do it the most and the best. So the recursivity then is kind of self-perpetuating.
Okay, we have a couple of questions more. There's Dee, there's Barry, and there's Ari in that order. Preferably very short questions. Okay, Dee, the floor is yours.
Yes, hi, thank you very much. I have to say, I found this topic to be very complex, if I may say so. So just a little bit of context and a short question. I'm a theater practitioner. I'm from Southern Africa, Lesotho, and my students are non-native English speakers. And they often find, say, the works of, I don't know, Jane Austen, Sam Shepard, or Shakespeare, very difficult, you know, and like just trying to grapple with the language aspect is quite difficult. Now, which aspect of your presentation might speak to that difficulty that non-native speakers of a particular language, non-native speakers of, let's say, English, experience when exploring, say, you know, American or other literature from other countries?
Well, let me begin on that one just briefly. One of the issues that speaks to concerns standardization, concerns some notion that English is all one thing, and that there are better and worse manifestations of it. And therefore, certain works, certain writers, even from a relatively distant past, like Shakespeare, are held up as the best exemplars of this standard. And then there's a problem because, in fact, those ways of speaking are actually more locally situated, as are the people who are trying to gain access to them.
Right.
So let me,
please.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah.
Let me add that we need the concept of genre. Because I have to say that although I'm a pretty good English speaker, Shakespeare throws me off. I mean, I either have to read it ahead of time, but also Jane Austen can also throw you off. There are lots of locutions. She writes in a certain genre, which may or may not have been how everybody spoke at the time. So I'm not sure that it's simply historical. And that's something that I think theater people are usually very, very conscious of. And as Judy said, the concept of standard and standard language deliberately erases these things, deliberately erases genre differences. And that I think is a real problem for real speakers and for performers in particular.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, that sort of puts all of this in perspective. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Mary?
Yes, thank you very much for the talk. I really appreciated it. I have a methodological question, and I really like the idea of synthesis approach and having an object of attention, and then following the flow of semiotic activities that flows from it. But if you know your sort of object of activity, let's say what language ideologies are sort of expressed in everyday discursive practices in preschool or whatever context, it's hard to pinpoint one lexical item or phrase or particular object. If the object is sort of dispersed discursively, how do you go about thinking about it?
Well, if I understand your question, and I'm not entirely sure that I do, but I would. My instinct is to respond by saying if the object of your interest, let's say, which is an object of attention for some set of people, if this is found in lots of places, pick one and proceed from there. It is to take that as your starting point. You need a starting point before you can branch out from it. And methodologically, it's the branchings and where all those things take you. Who says what about this? Who, if it's some element of language, who is using it? Where, when, where did it come from? You know, so it's like with the bus stop benches, we started from one. And then it turned out there were many such benches and there was a lot of discourse about them, and you could watch people either sitting on the bench or not. Were they reading while they sat on the bench? Did they pay attention to the slogan? Did they comment on it? And so forth.
Mm-hmm. You might also find, I think that's right, and you might also find that what you have taken to be a single thing is not actually a single thing.
Mm.
So if you work out from one in its links as people take it up, you might find actually that there's a subdivision in some places, which is very informative, which would be really quite interesting.
Right, thanks a lot, Ari.
Yeah.
Yes, please. You're muted. Ari, can you put on your mic?
Sorry. Thanks
Yes,
so
sir.
much for a wonderful talk. I'll just ask you one question. Actually, I have many, but would your own shift from the construct of regimes of ideology to regimes of value be an example of fractal recursivity? And if so, could you elaborate on that little process that you guys went through? Thanks.
I mean, from what we said in that volume?
Yeah, so this that's your construct, right? The idea of regimes of value as maybe not as opposed to, but as an extension of, or as a style shift from, I don't know what you want to call it here. Is that actually an example of fractal recursivity? And why did you keep the word regimes? Because I would have probably shifted that to forces to, again, be a little bit more away from just governmental stuff kind of thinking.
You know, you want, should I
Well,
start with?
I mean, first of all, if you're thinking of the title of the volume in which an earlier paper of ours appeared, that title came late and was not a title that we invented. It was one that I guess came out of some late discussion because the volume editor was going to call it something else. And then I think that title came from Michael Silverstein, really, not, no. So there it was. We didn't invent that one.
Yeah.
Now I've forgotten the next part of the question.
Can I, maybe if I say something that will bring it back to you, Judy. I think that we have been concerned about value all along.
Right.
I think that that has been part of the notion of language ideologies, and certainly of differentiation. And so for me, it really seemed worthwhile to have both the activity, rather, as Judy said in her part of our presentation, that language ideology made it seem like a rock. And we didn't want that. We wanted it to be active, of a kind of process rather than a thing. Great. And the other thing that ideology, of course, itself often includes, but isn't often not highlighted, is the question of value. And so I think regime of value was a way of drawing attention to ideological work brings about or makes evident the values of those who are doing it. And I think for me, that was what was important. Regime is usually in linguistic anthropology has become a way of talking about a form of constraint rather than necessarily a politics, although I get your point that politics is what it invokes. It seems to connote politics.
Well, right. I mean, just as ideology, in our view, is not something where what we're interested in is some doctrine imposed from above, but rather our assumptions and stereotypes and so forth that people work with in everyday life. So regime, in this sense, is not something that means the state particularly. It can mean that, but it's not only that. It is something constraining, something organizing in many realms of activity and for all kinds of people.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Two very final questions from the chat, and I'll take them together. Adrian wishes to know what your thoughts are on the universal dimension in local semiotics and political performances. The question is as follows. In your ethnography in Senegal, have you had the opportunity to observe the extent to which traditional griots, their semiotics, are influenced both by their current sociocultural realities and by much more global realities? And Adrian gives examples with words or names such as perestroika, Sarajevo, Saddam Hussein, which are commonly used in the DRC by artists to express their own local experiences. And then Stephanie revisits the notion of erasure in the context of politeness register in Clonipa and how male usage has been omitted in this research. Stephanie would like you to kindly elaborate briefly on how you think this could also be related to gender politics more generally in ethnographical research.
These two questions seem both especially connected to my ethnographic experiences. So first I'm going to punt on the Senegal one, which is that the research I did in Senegal is now quite some time ago. I have not been able to be doing ethnographic field work there. Well, I mean, I have not done, I won't say just I have not been able to, but I have not been very currently engaged in that. My last trip to Senegal was in 2006. So it's a while back now. And that was, not for sustained field work. So I can't really speak to this point about current global realities there, in griots there. In 2006, I saw some of the same kinds of ideas seem to be enacted, but I didn't see a lot of formal griot performances, which is partly what you seem to be thinking about. Now, as for the Hlonipa, I have a paper that's partly on that I co-authored with Liz Gunner that maybe you know, Stephanie. And in fact, in terms of Hlonipa and gender issues, I and we are quite indebted to your work, which is so interesting on the use of Hlonipa kinds of forms in gay male usage in South Africa. And I think that it is very much the case that the lack of attention to male usage of Hlonipa forms is very much linked to gender politics that goes back well into the colonial period for what the colonial observers, the European observers, what they noticed, what they thought was important, what they thought was the proper place of men and women. It's partly that. It's also the fact that when the British finally defeated the Zulu state, the army was dispersed. And I believe that the army was one of the sites for male Hlonipa performance that became no longer relevant. So, I mean, it's hard to demonstrate that. I'm looking for for useful evidence about that. A little, but it's not that good. But so anyway, it's still the gender politics that erase male usage of Hlonipa forms are still going on. And they are still going on among, for outside researchers that write about this as if it's only women who ever do this, you know, which wasn't true then, isn't true now.
May I say something? I certainly cannot speak to the African materials that the question is about, but I can say that what was said, what the question says about Senegal's griots and those elsewhere in the DRC, for instance, is something that is a question that can be asked, for instance, and has been by one of my students, about rap in Yugoslavia. That is the incorporation into what is understood as local musical forms and local poetic forms of things that are marked as from elsewhere, but are being incorporated in ways that are specific to that local context. So we have lots of we have lots of rap everywhere, but I think it's a fascinating question what exactly that's doing. And linguistically, it's difficult and interesting and difficult as well, whether or not different languages seem to be differently attuned and amenable to doing rap. But people do it, whether or not the language is amenable, as a way of signaling certain kinds of international relations and positionalities within their own local context. So it's a fascinating question. I have no idea whether traditional griots are doing it or not, but boy, it's everywhere in Eastern Europe. This form of combining other contexts of music from other countries.
Well, I would just suspect, and this is simply a guess, that with the griots, that much depends on whether they are being whether they are being billed as traditional griots and put on a sort of folklorized stage as that. And this here we now have a performance of of traditional history by a traditional griot, as opposed to when they're in a very local context and people from some family are getting married and they're doing their thing. My guess is that there's a difference between those genres, but again, I can't speak to it more specifically.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Just as we draw the curtain, Susan, in responding to Rebecca earlier on, you had mentioned some author in connection with a book on language and expertise. Rebecca wonders if you could perhaps share the names of the author or authors of the book.
I will write them in the chat. Is that?
Okay. That's fine. Okay, well, all that is left for me now to do is to thank you both for a very inspiring talk. And like I did say at the beginning, it's a huge fan base you have here on the forum. We are very delighted that you spent the last 2 hours sharing your expertise, your insight, your work with us. And we'll be leaving this session a lot richer thanks to our engagement with you. Kim, would you like to let us know who our next speaker would be?
Maybe before that, I could thank everybody for being here, and thank thank you again for the invitation. It's been really interesting and enlightening to talk to you all and to think through the really wonderful questions that you've posed for us. So thank you for listening and for the questions and the engagement with our work. Thank you.
Absolutely. For me too.
Thanks.
Okay, so Kim.
Yes, so next week on Friday, November 19th, we'll be back to our usual time of 9 a.m. Eastern US time, and we'll hear from Maria Paula Menezes from the University of Coimbra, and she'll be talking about knowledge is born in the struggle, constructing the epistemologies of the global South. So we hope you can join us again next week. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy your weekend.